This is the story of how Canada quietly redirected grain shipments away from United States ports and toward Mexico, Asia, and direct bilateral routes. How railway infrastructure that was built to serve American interests is now being used to bypass them, and how United States exporters who assumed Canadian grain would always flow through their terminals are watching billions in business disappear to competitors who treat Canada as a partner rather than a subordinate. But before we dive into this incredible story, if you appreciate in-depth analysis like this, hit that like button and subscribe to stay informed on the stories that truly matter. Tonight, we are showing you the real railway networks that make this redirection possible, which United States ports are losing Canadian grain, and what happens when your most reliable supplier decides your services are no longer worth the chaos. To understand how Canada is redirecting grain away from United States export channels, you need to understand the railway that makes it possible. Canadian Pacific, Kansas City. CPKC was created in 2023 when Canadian Pacific acquired Kansas City Southern, forming the first single-line railway connecting Canada, the United States, and Mexico. That 3,200-mile Manitoba to Mexico City grain train was not a publicity stunt, it was proof of concept. According to CPKC's official statements, the railroad moves a variety of Canadian grains to Mexico, including wheat, oats, canola oils, and specialty crops. This is not occasional shipments, this is building systematic trade flows that bypass United States export terminals entirely. Keith Creel, CPKC president and CEO, said it explicitly: "Our powerful North American rail network is enhancing safety, competition, and resiliency, and expanding route options and market access for Canada's grain shippers." With grain and other customers looking to diversify their end markets amid trade policy uncertainty, CPKC is uniquely serving as a land bridge between Canada and Mexico. That phrase, trade policy uncertainty, is diplomatic code for Trump's chaos. Tariff threats, canceled negotiations, unpredictable border enforcement, all of it has convinced Canadian grain shippers that depending on United States export infrastructure is too risky. So they are using CPKC's integrated network to ship directly to buyers who offer stable, predictable partnerships. And here is what makes this particularly threatening to United States interests. Most of the 3,200-mile route from Manitoba to Mexico City crosses United States territory. CPKC trains traverse American states using American rail infrastructure, with American crew members managing segments of the journey. According to industry reports, there are approximately 11 CPKC crew changes on the route within the United States. So United States workers are being paid to move Canadian grain to Mexican buyers' grain that used to go through United States export terminals, generating fees for American port operators, American grain handlers, and American shipping companies. The infrastructure benefits are remaining in the United States, but the export business is going elsewhere. According to Transport Canada's Pathways report, over 94% of Canadian grain exported to foreign markets is transported by rail to ports and to final destinations in the United States and Mexico. That statistic reveals both the dominance of rail in Canadian grain logistics and the strategic importance of controlling railway routes. In 2023, Canadian National Railway transported 21 million metric tons of grain toward Western Canada ports, 4.54 million metric tons toward Eastern Canada, and 1.85 million metric tons toward the United States. CPKC, meanwhile, transported 5.51 million metric tons to the United States and 5.25 million metric tons to Eastern Canada. But here is what those numbers do not show: the shift happening in 2024 and 2025. CPKC's grain plan for 2025 to 2026 explicitly states that the company is expanding route options and market access and helping customers diversify their end markets amid trade policy uncertainty. Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada estimated the 2025 Canadian crop at approximately 94 million metric tons, with Western Canada accounting for roughly 70 million metric tons. CN anticipates moving 27 to 29.5 million metric tons during the 2025 to 2026 crop year. Those are massive volumes, and increasingly, those volumes are not flowing through United States, Gulf Coast, or Pacific Northwest export terminals. They are going directly to Mexico via CPKC, or to Eastern Canadian ports for overseas shipment, or to Asian markets through expanded West Coast capacity. The redirection is gradual, but it is structural. Every train load that goes to Mexico City instead of Houston is a train load that United States exporters lost. Every grain shipment that goes through the Port of Vancouver instead of Seattle is revenue that American port operators will never recapture. Mexico is not traditionally thought of as a major grain destination, but that is changing rapidly, and CPKC is positioning itself to capitalize on that change. Mexico's feed grain demand is growing due to expanding livestock and poultry industries. Mexican food processors need wheat, oats, and specialty crops. And crucially, Mexico offers something United States buyers cannot: stability in the face of Trump's trade chaos. When CPKC delivers Canadian grain directly to Mexico City, it bypasses United States ports, United States export terminals, United States inspectors, and United States bureaucracy. The transaction is purely Canada-Mexico bilateral trade, using CPKC as a land bridge. For Canadian grain farmers and traders, this arrangement offers multiple advantages. First, it diversifies their customer base away from overwhelming dependence on United States and Asian buyers. Second, it reduces exposure to United States trade policy chaos, no risk of sudden port disruptions or export restrictions. Third, it builds relationships with Mexican buyers who are actively looking to reduce their own dependence on United States grain imports. And for CPKC, every train load of Canadian grain delivered to Mexico generates revenue across the entire 3,200-mile route. The railroad is incentivized to actively market Canadian grain to Mexican buyers, creating a structural shift in trade flows that will persist long after Trump leaves office. Canada even launched electronic phytosanitary export certificates for grain to Mexico in November 2025, specifically to facilitate this trade. According to the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, the electronic system reduces the risk of fraud and eliminates longer delivery times associated with mailing paper documents. The infrastructure being built is designed for long-term systematic trade, not occasional opportunistic shipments. So which United States ports are actually losing Canadian grain shipments? Let's trace the flow. Pacific Northwest ports, Seattle, Tacoma, and Portland historically handled massive volumes of Canadian grain destined for Asian markets. Grain would move by rail from the Canadian prairies to these United States ports, get loaded onto ships, and sail to Japan, South Korea, China, Indonesia, and other Asian buyers. But Canada has been systematically expanding its own West Coast export capacity. The Port of Vancouver handled approximately 20 million metric tons of grain in recent years. The Port of Prince Rupert is being expanded specifically to handle more grain exports. When Canadian grain goes through Canadian ports to Asian markets, United States Pacific Northwest terminals lose the business. According to industry reports, Canadian grain exports through Vancouver have been setting records. The expansion of port capacity, combined with CN and CPKC investments in rail efficiency, means Canadian grain can reach Asian buyers through Canadian infrastructure without touching United States soil. Gulf Coast ports, Houston, New Orleans, and other Gulf ports used to handle significant Canadian grain, moving south for export to Latin America and overseas markets. But if Canadian grain is going directly to Mexico via CPKC or shipping from eastern Canadian ports like Montreal and Quebec, those Gulf Coast volumes disappear. The Port of Thunder Bay, which handled 1.4 million metric tons of grain, serves as a key connection point for moving Canadian grain to eastern ports and avoiding United States Gulf Coast terminals entirely. Great Lakes ports. Duluth and other Great Lakes terminals traditionally handled Canadian grain moving through the St. Lawrence Seaway system. But eastern Canadian ports, Montreal with 4 million metric tons and Quebec with 3.4 million metric tons, are capturing more of that business as Canadian shippers prioritize routes that do not depend on United States. Cooperation. The cumulative impact of these shifts is significant. United States ports that depend on Canadian grain for volumes are facing declining throughput. Port workers face reduced hours. Terminal operators face lower revenues. And the entire ecosystem of businesses that support grain exports, inspectors, logistics companies, freight forwarders are experiencing contraction. Here is a consequence of Canada's grain redirection that most people have not considered: price impacts in United States export markets. When Canadian grain flowed reliably through United States ports to global buyers, it provided supply stability that helped United States grain exporters compete globally. American wheat, corn, and other grains could be commingled or shipped alongside Canadian grain, creating economies of scale in shipping and logistics. But as Canadian grain gets redirected away from United States export channels, those efficiencies disappear. United States grain exporters face higher per-unit shipping costs because they are handling smaller volumes. They lose blending opportunities that allowed them to meet specific buyer quality requirements. And they face more competition from Canadian grain that is now being marketed directly to buyers rather than through United States intermediaries. In 2023, the average market price of wheat in Quebec was $364 per metric ton, while prices in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta averaged $391, $386, and $397 per metric ton respectively. Those price differentials reflect transportation costs, quality factors, and market access. As Canadian grain finds more efficient routes to Mexican, Asian, and other buyers, routes that bypass United States infrastructure and United States markups, Canadian grain becomes more price competitive globally. That forces United States grain exporters to either cut their margins or lose market share. This is the hidden cost of Trump's trade chaos, not just lost port revenues, but eroding competitiveness for United States agricultural exporters who depend on integrated North American supply chains to compete globally. None of